Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Gospel Topic Essays Reviews that we're doing for the Mormon Discussion Podcast. Today, three of us are gathered together to discuss and explore each of our personal experiences with the Book of Mormon and DNA Studies essay. So I'm one of your hosts, Anthony Miller. I participated in some of these other episodes with Alan Mount and Bill Reel. And today I have joining us Sarah Newcomb and Michelle Vroom. And I was wondering if you would each introduce yourself a little bit and let us know where you're coming from. Sarah, would you briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, I run the LamaniteTruth.com blog. I was a member 38 years and been out 3 years now. So just working on the website some, and I've been on a couple podcasts, but yeah, mainly the blog is what I work on, and excited to talk about the Book of Mormon and DNA Studies essay.
Before we started recording, you let us know a little bit about your ancestral situation and why this might apply to you. Could you share that a little bit with us?
So on my dad's side, I'm seventh generation Mormon. On my mom's side, she was the first in her family to join the church. And she is Tsimshian. It is a tribe from Alaska, originally British Columbia area, but a small group moved down to Alaska in the Aleutian chain. And she joined in the 60s. She served a mission on the Navajo reservation. This was during Spencer W. Kimball's time. And so there's a lot of things that everybody was talking about in those days that is less talked about now, though still very relevant and still part of Mormon beliefs, such as darkened skin as being a sign of the curse or curse, and Lamanite heritage. So I was raised being taught that I was a Lamanite, that my people were all Lamanites, that my skin was dark because of the curse I had inherited, and that my ancestors were what was talked about in the Book of Mormon, that they turned away from God, that they became evil, that God completely withdrew his spirit from them. So 3 years ago when I was just leaving the church, this wasn't the result of racism, actually. It was due to a lot of the historical stuff that a lot of other people struggle with. Very typical. I'd read the Journal of Discourses because I saw it referenced in a lot of lesson manuals, and it just kind of led me down this path of, I need answers. I need to know more. I need to know more. And the more I knew, the more I saw that things weren't quite as they were presented. And once I left the church, it wasn't long after deciding to leave that it just hit me that I wasn't Lamanite, that what had been taught to me all my life wasn't true, and that my true culture had actually been appropriated and twisted. So I started another journey after I left of reclaiming my identity, dealing with the trauma of having that identity twisted. It's kind of a unique experience, and I realized there was not really a lot out there that helped me deal with having been told that I was Lamanite and coming out of the church. So I searched everywhere. I found some experiences on Reddit, but because I couldn't find a lot, I started the LamaniteTruth.com blog to kind of validate my own experience and just process what happened to me, because I'm a writer. I love to write. So I was like, I'll just do a blog. And also I had hoped that people that had experienced something similar to me would be able to find that validation or say, hey, that was what happened to me. And it's mostly just my reactions to history. So it's not super academic or anything. But the sources, like if people look at the sources I cite, it brings it all back to church websites, church-produced material, and it's basically my reactions to those things. And I'm honestly still a bit on the journey of healing from everything. But that's where the Book of Mormon and DNA Studies, I have quite a few opinions about it and reactions to it, so I'm excited to talk about it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think that a lot of us, as we read the essays and read the footnotes and study from cited sources and so forth, we have a range of experiences based on what we're bringing to the table. And certainly your experiences are going to maybe offer us some ideas where maybe people that have had different experiences maybe have some blind spots. So I'm excited to have you with us. So Michelle, would you briefly introduce yourself as well?
Of course. So I graduated BYU Idaho in 2017 alongside my husband, and we both served missions. And currently my husband, he has actually been working on something called Super Elders. It's a comic, and we generate a lot of ideas to reach a post-Mormon and transitioning Mormon audience. And it's going to be a full completed graphic novel in time. But what led us to really question and start our investigative journey is basically when we had our daughter and realized we couldn't present this worldview to her. And so that kind of sent us down the rabbit hole, and I began researching pretty intensely for a long time. And then my husband, he just had to read about half the CES letter and he was out. So with all that information, I wanted to be able to get it out and review it.
Thank you for sharing that. So in any event, what we're going to do is, like we've done in some of the other episodes, is we're going to read the essay, line by line or paragraph by paragraph, section by section, and then kind of share what our individual experiences are with the essay. But one more thing that I would ask before we start reading would be to ask your take on what you think this essay was intended to do and who the target audience is and what they were really trying to communicate. This is only one of 13 essays, and there's a lot of different topics that could be covered. Why did they choose this one? What were they trying to communicate, and what is the target audience? Sarah, what thoughts do you have about that?
Yeah, the first time I read it, my personal take was that it was not written for non-members or non-believers. It was written to comfort those who believed in Mormonism and who were being challenged by the DNA finds, that academics were having. So the church had to deal with it on some level because DNA studies have shown that Native Americans have a completely different heritage than what the Book of Mormon was stating. So yeah, this essay is written in a way, in my opinion, that believers can find some comfort, as if there's a chance that, yes, the Lamanites are real, they're somewhere. And yeah, that was my personal take on it.
Michelle, do you have thoughts to share on that?
Yes. So throughout a lot of the Book of Mormon, it's pretty clear that they believe dark skin is cursed. And on my mission with time experiences with other people, they've tried to kind of rewrite that or redefine that many times, even though it's very definitive. And I feel like this essay is trying to downplay that, the kind of open racism in the Book of Mormon, and use some basic intellectual principles to present to believers that it's still possible that their origins are of a certain way, with downplaying the overall racism that is connected to it.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to share, from the title page of the Book of Mormon, which Joseph Smith indicated was a translation, not just his own words, is what he suggested. From the title page in the Book of Mormon, it indicates that the purpose of the record includes to show, I'm reading a quote now, to show unto the remnant of the house of Israel what great things the Lord hath done for their fathers, indicating that this is for lineal descendants of the house of Israel, and that they may know the covenants of the Lord, that they are not cast off forever, and also to the convincing of the Jew and Gentile that Jesus is the Christ, the eternal God, manifesting himself to all nations. One of the main purposes of the Book of Mormon, and I think if we were to go through and read some additional passages from the Book of Mormon, is supposedly to be written for or to the Lamanites. The very first sentence in that title page is that it's an abridgment of the record of the people of Nephi and also of the Lamanites, written to the Lamanites, who are a remnant of the house of Israel, and also to the Jew and Gentile, indicating that the purpose of the Book of Mormon is supposed to be specifically for the Lamanites. And one of the challenges, I think, with this essay is if we don't know who the Lamanites are, how can we possibly be fulfilling the purpose of the Book of Mormon? Anyway, that kind of gets messy. All right. So I go ahead.
I was just going to say that's one of the things that as I've gone down my path of healing, that I felt really strongly about, is that the Book of Mormon, aside from, the edition that they did in the 1950s, 60s, whenever they added the introduction where it says that they were the principal ancestors. Now they've changed that, but it was not originally part of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
The introduction wasn't.
Yeah.
And aside from how people interpreted the Book of Mormon, nowhere in the Book of Mormon does it specify who the Lamanites are. So from the standpoint of not trying to tell believing Indigenous members who they are, and not trying to tell non-Mormon Indigenous people who they are, there's no way to say who the Lamanites are. And so the reason I think this DNA essay exists is not because the Book of Mormon declared who the Lamanites are. It never identified specific groups of people. It's because the church has taught all Indigenous people that are members, that are in North America, South America, and the Pacific Islands, that they are Lamanites. So that's why the DNA essay is so relevant, is that due to interpretations of what the Book of Mormon is, due to interpretation of who the Lamanites are, people took a lot of power and used that to tell Indigenous people who they were. And that's not something that needs to happen. Like, it shouldn't matter who the Indigenous person is, what church they decide to join. Their culture and identity should not be co-opted in the way that it has been. And so that's not necessarily the Book of Mormon stating who the Lamanites are. And so when we talk about what you're talking about, how the purpose of the Book of Mormon is to, redeem the Lamanites, the reality is we don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
And so identifying who Lamanites are is where the church has gotten itself kind of into a corner.
That's true.
Yeah. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and read the first little paragraph there, and then we'll just go from there. So the essay is Book of Mormon and DNA Studies. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints affirms that the Book of Mormon is a volume of sacred scripture comparable to the Bible. It contains a record of God's dealings with three groups of people who migrated from the Near East or West Asia to the Americas hundreds of years before the arrival of the Europeans. Next paragraph. Although the primary purpose of the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical, some people have wondered whether the migrations it describes are compatible with scientific studies of ancient America. The discussion has centered on the field of population genetics and developments in DNA science. Some have contended that the migrations mentioned in the Book of Mormon did not occur because the majority of DNA identified to date in modern Native peoples most closely resembles that of Eastern Asian populations. So with those two paragraphs, what thoughts do you have? Michelle, you wrote something in the notes there.
Yes, I did. So the very first line kind of demonstrated to me that belief perseverance was taking place. And that kind of goes along with the fact that the church believes it's the very truest book on the face of the earth. So the Bible was composed from multiple documents that have been preserved by several authors. Whereas the Book of Mormon was written, or quote unquote translated, by one author, which is Joseph Smith. The original evidence for his translation was supposedly a heavy set of gold plates, and those were taken from him by an angel. So the single text source for the Book of Mormon, which boasts many authors, was found in one location, conveniently the same location that Joseph Smith grew up, practicing his employment as a treasure digger. And yet, when he was not able to translate original Bible texts, even though he went ahead and revised the Bible. But the original Bible texts don't correlate or correspond with the Bible revisions, showing that kind of that was made up as well. So to make up a claim that it's comparable to the Bible in the very first statement is showing that basic childhood indoctrination fighting in place of logic. And it's trying to, like Sarah was saying earlier, it's trying to support the point that help those that were taught that they were Lamanites, regardless of any evidence for it, that there still is possible correlation to them being Lamanites.
Yeah, that's a good point. The Book of Mormon is comparable to the King James version of the Bible very strongly. There are lots of correlations, but when you look at older biblical texts that are superior translations to, or read superior translations of the Bible, then that's when you see a lot more disparities arise. Sarah, did you have comments about those first two paragraphs?
When I was reading the Book of Mormon and DNA Studies essay, I read a lot between the lines. They throw a lot out there with science trying to say there's a chance, that to back up their Lamanite identity, that they've identified so many people as modern native people as Lamanites. And so reading between the lines, it still just comes back to the same thing for me. It doesn't really matter to me whether it's spiritual or historical. The point is the DNA has shown, and if I'm honest, like indigenous history that has been handed down for thousands of years, where we have come from, anthropology, so many different fields of study back up the fact that Native Americans are not Lamanite. But reading between the lines, it's them trying to use science to prove a spiritual history when they say the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical. Right there, that stood out to me. That was the first thing that stood out to me when I read this essay, was that the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical. Great. Anybody should be able to join the church and believe it, find peace in it. But if it's more spiritual than historical, nobody should be identified as Lamanite.
Yeah, those are definitely important ideas. I'd also mention that as I was reading through this essay, it sounded kind of like a lawyer carefully parses things to try to express things, and so it uses very carefully parsed words. Like multiple times through the essay, we'll see them use the word majority. But when you look at the footnotes and then go to cited sources and read reviews of the essays, it's more than 99% of the DNA, would not be applicable, from East Asian populations. But they use the word majority instead of nearly 100%, and so it didn't feel entirely, this wasn't the first essay that I read. With the other essays that I read, it seemed like that they were carefully parsing things to allow for some ambiguity, but without being really clear. And I perceived the same thing with this essay.
And that's where it's written for members, to give them hope that there's a chance. Just like in that second paragraph, the other thing that stood out to me, where it says the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical, it says, some people have wondered, and I was like, some people have wondered, where it's talking about some people have wondered whether the migrations it describes are compatible with scientific studies. They talk about some people have wondered, but they have taught everybody. And it's not just at general conferences or in some talk. They literally taught indigenous people in seminary classes, in official church lesson manuals with maps.
Yep.
That everybody in North America, South America, and Pacific Islands are Lamanite. So some people, it's not some people when it comes to the active Mormon church. It's everybody.
Yeah, I have my parents divorced when I was in my teens, and then my mother remarried, and I have a stepsister who is adopted, and she was adopted as part of the Lamanite adoption program. And growing up, not to tell her story, but my sense is that it wasn't a wondering thing. I mean, she was told that she was Lamanite the whole time. There wasn't. It was taught with a degree of certainty.
There was no doubt for me. I was taught that all through my childhood.
Yeah.
And
all right.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to go to the next paragraph, but you can finish.
Well, I was just going to say my mom on her mission would have her Anglo companions put their arms next to hers, and they told her she was getting lighter because she had been embracing the gospel.
Yeah, that's not.
She believed it. She
believed not
skin
helpful.
changes.
And I've read that too.
Right.
History.
Right. And if your skin doesn't change, does that mean you're not being righteous enough or something? That's very, very difficult.
Which also applies to like how you view your family that hasn't joined the church. that has darker skin.
Right. Their skin is darker because they didn't join the church. Yeah. Yeah. Very toxic. All right. So next paragraph is basic principles of population genetics suggests the need for a more careful approach to the data. The conclusions of genetics, like those of any science, are tentative, and much work remains to be done to fully understand the origins of the native populations of the Americas. Nothing is known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples, and even if their genetic profile were known, there are sound scientific reasons that it might remain undetected. For these same reasons, arguments that some defenders of the Book of Mormon make based on DNA studies are also speculative. In short, DNA studies cannot be used decisively to either affirm or reject the historical authenticity of the Book of Mormon. So, Michelle, what thoughts do you have about that paragraph?
So one point that makes, again, going back to how the Book of Mormon and the Bible is not comparable at all. The Bible has original text sourced from original locations. Kind of in the notes that you said, non-apologetic scholars believe that the Israelites came from the Canaanites, and there's some historical possibility of a King David. And then we do have strong DNA from the Jews post-Babylonian captivity and having historical data for many events and people in the Bible, whereas there's no historical data for a single person from the Book of Mormon. And it says right there, there's nothing known about the DNA of those in the Book of Mormon. And yet, because so many people have been taught that they are descendants of the Lamanites, there's scientific conclusions that are irrelevant and uncorrelated to this entire essay made to try to still sell that to those who have been taught that and those who will be continue to be taught that.
Yeah, thank you. And Sarah, what comments do you have about that paragraph?
Kind of along with what Michelle says with how they say there's no evidence or information about the DNA of the Book of Mormon people. It doesn't matter. There's a lot of DNA evidence of who the people are in the Americas, and It doesn't correspond anyways. It's over 99%. And it comes back to, again, if they don't know, they shouldn't be teaching it. But also in that paragraph, I wrote a little note on that one. It says, and much work remains to be done to fully understand the origins of the native populations of the Americas. This has been a part of the trauma and history of indigenous people, is being told who they were, being told that it wasn't okay, what their religious beliefs were, being told where they came from or where they didn't come from. And this is offensive to indigenous people because we know our origins, we know our history, and reading between the lines in that paragraph, they admit they do not understand the origins of indigenous populations. And so in the very end, that last sentence in that paragraph says DNA studies cannot be used decisively to either affirm or reject the historical authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Yet just a few paragraphs above, they said it's more spiritual than historical. And so they go back and forth. It's kind of an odd essay to me. They can't take a single track.
Right, and they overemphasize speculative, and conclusions, and then they use words like majority, where it's more than 99%. And there have been extensive DNA studies for indigenous peoples in the Americas, so way more than it seems like what they're suggesting here.
And what's interesting with their use of the word speculative is that they have come out and told people to stop speculating.
Right.
About location. And I'm like, is not calling everybody Lamanite speculation?
That's a perfect point. Like when they use the word speculative, or it appears that, it seems that, that's plausible deniability right there. They're trying to mix their philosophies with science, as the church says, philosophies of men mingle with scripture. They're trying to use science because that's what will pacify members to glance at this and be like, oh, okay, they know what they're talking about there. Even though the entire essay, there's no DNA evidence for people of the Book of Mormon, the essay is still about Book of Mormon and DNA studies, which can exist because there's no DNA evidence for anyone in the Book of Mormon.
Right. Yeah. So for the listeners, Sarah is referring to, there's a little mini essay that came out from the church not too long ago, suggesting that the church doesn't have an official position on where the Book of Mormon supposedly would have happened, whether it was in Mesoamerica or in the Heartland or whatnot. There's all sorts of groups that are, have different arguments as to, they're arguing historicity and the actual location of where the events took place. So Michelle, would you read the next, let's see, 1, 2, maybe 3 paragraphs to footnote 7, and then we'll talk about those 3 paragraphs.
The evidence assembled to date suggests that the majority of Native Americans carry largely Asian DNA. Scientists theorize that in an era that predated Book of Mormon accounts, a relatively small group of people migrated from Northeast Asia to the Americas by way of a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska. These people, scientists say, spread rapidly to fill North and South America and were likely the primary ancestors of modern America.
That's kind of interesting. First of all, there's the majority there again, which is the studies are that over 99% of Native Americans carry that DNA. And then they say that a small group came and then they rapidly filled the entire hemisphere, but we're talking over thousands of years, so how rapid is that? But it's estimated, my recollection from reading these things is that it was around 13,000 or more years ago when this migration happened. And the Book of Mormon times are supposed to be around maybe 2000 BC, plus or minus supposedly for the Jaredites. And then between 600 BC and 400 AD for the Lehites, basically, which is a very small period of time. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting that they're trying to. It seems like they're trying to compress the timeline of when things happened, and it really the expansion of indigenous peoples across the Americas took thousands of years to do.
That's a really good point, especially when they emphasized right at the beginning, there's nothing known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples. It's reinforcing irrational belief because there are relics and artifacts and all kinds of discoveries from millions of years ago all over the world. So with a population as big as that promoted in the Book of Mormon, there should be something to be able to verify what they're saying here.
Yeah, and I would add 2 more things for the listener as we're going through this. The ancestors of the indigenous peoples or the Native Americans in the Western Hemisphere, they immigrated between 13 and 15,000 years ago. That's pretty problematic for the Jewish origin myths that we claim as doctrine in the church with regard to a Garden of Eden, a single Adamic language, and a Tower of Babel, a global flood, things like that have been taught, or reconciliations for those kinds of things. This idea that these peoples immigrated 13 to 15,000 years ago and they had different languages and spiritual practices and things like that are pretty problematic for the Jewish origin myths that are referenced in the Book of Mormon. But in any event, so Michelle, would you, unless Sarah, you wanted to say something, Michelle, would you continue in the next paragraph?
The only thing I had to say was that by saying the majority, where they talk about the majority of Native Americans carry largely Asian DNA, I find it misleading that they're not willing to put percentages there. The majority is over 99%. And that misleads believers. Where they say the majority, it also leaves room for, well, what's the majority? 50%, 57%, 60%. It's 99, over 99. And the problem that the church has is that they've told 100% of indigenous people in those, in the places I've said, North, South, and Pacific Islands, that they're all Lamanite. So it's just misleading.
Yeah, but there's a chance, right?
But there's a chance, yeah.
From that movie Dumb and Dumber, right?
Yeah, I read that in my notes, in fact, I think.
One in a million. So there's a chance, yeah.
Santa Claus could be real.
Yeah. All right. Michelle, would you continue with the next paragraph?
The Book of Mormon provides little direct information about cultural contact between the peoples it describes and others who may have lived nearby. Consequently, most early Latter-day Saints assumed that Near Easterners or West Asians like Jared, Lehi, Mulek, and their companions were the first or the largest or even the only groups to settle in the Americas. Building upon this assumption, critics insist that the Book of Mormon does not allow for the presence of other large populations in the Americas, and that, therefore, Near Eastern DNA should be easily identifiable among modern Native groups.
Yeah. So we'll talk about more about a little bit later, and I'll read a passage from the Book of Mormon that pushes back on that a little bit. But yeah, the Book of Mormon doesn't necessitate that there weren't other populations, but it also says that the land was saved for just the righteous people too. So in any event. All right, go ahead and continue if you would.
The Book of Mormon itself, however, does not claim that the peoples it describes were either the predominant or the exclusive inhabitants of the lands they occupied. In fact, cultural and demographic clues in its text hint at the presence of other groups. At the April 1929 General Conference, President Anthony W. Ivins of the First Presidency cautioned, "We must be careful in conclusions that we reach. The Book of Mormon does not tell us that there was no one here before them, the peoples it describes. It does not tell us that people did not come after."
Actually, I want to go ahead and read the words of Lehi. In 2 Nephi 1, verses 8 through 9, these are the words of Lehi. In verse 8, "And behold, it is wisdom that this land should be kept as yet from the knowledge of other nations. For behold, many nations would overrun the land, and there would be no place for an inheritance," indicating that it was a land of inheritance. In verse 9, "Wherefore I, Lehi, have obtained a promise that inasmuch as those whom the Lord God shall bring out of the land of Jerusalem shall keep his commandments, they shall prosper upon the face of the land, and they shall be kept from all other nations, that they may possess this land unto themselves." That sounds like it's pretty limited in terms of who would possess the land.
Pretty exclusive.
Yeah, "and if it so be that they shall keep his commandments, they shall be blessed upon the face of this land, and there shall be none to molest them," sounds exclusive, "nor to take away the land of their inheritance, and they shall dwell safely forever." So, there are conflicting passages in the Book of Mormon, but that one seems to indicate that it wasn't like this hugely heavily populated area that was overrun and not exclusively preserved for the Lehites, basically. So, all right. Why don't you go ahead and continue then?
Joseph Smith appears to have been open to the idea of migrations other than those described in the Book of Mormon, and many Latter-day Saint leaders and scholars over the past century have found the Book of Mormon account to be fully consistent with the presence of other established populations. The 2006 update to the introduction of the Book of Mormon reflects their understanding by stating that the Book of Mormon peoples were among the ancestors of the American Indians.
Yeah, so on footnote 10, then I went back and I pulled my old Book of Mormon, and it said that Lamanites were proclaimed to be the principal ancestors of American Indians. And then after the DNA evidence emerged, the text was changed to among the ancestors of American Indians. I don't recall that, being publicly talked about. I recall it being changed without notification kind of thing. But in any
I
event.
didn't know about it until after I'd left. And these scriptures I'd had since, I think I got them before I went to college, and it had the original principal ancestors in it. I didn't know until after I'd left the church.
Yeah.
Or during that last little phase of leaving where I came across the essays finally.
Yeah. All right. Why don't you read, Michelle, the last paragraph there of that section?
All right, so it says, "Nothing is known about the extent of intermarriage and genetic mixing between the Book of Mormon peoples or their descendants and other inhabitants of the Americas, though some mixing appears evident even during the period covered by the book's text. What seems clear is that the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples likely represented only a fraction of all DNA in ancient America. Finding and clearly identifying their DNA today may be asking more of the science of population genetics that it is capable of proving. I feel like this entire paragraph just kind of restated there is no known DNA about the Book of Mormon peoples in a kind of finely crafted way.
Yes. The note that I added here is to be absolutely clear, no DNA evidence has been found of any Native American populations clearly placing a Near East population in the Americas from the time of Lehi, and extensive testing has been done and continues to be conducted in representative examples throughout the Americas and Pacific Islands, and still no DNA. LDS apologists have varying explanations for this. However, the genetic signature to most likely have been lost would have been in the manner of the Lehites and the Mulekites immigrating and then immediately intermingling with a much larger population than theirs, absolutely immediately upon their arrival. That's what would have needed to happen for some of the things that this essay talks about. And there are clues in the Book of Mormon that there might have been others in the Americas besides the Nephites and the Lamanites. However, it just doesn't make any sense that there would be an immediate integration, total genetic mixing without anything in the text from that. And the text suggests that the Lehite descendants become leaders and so forth, which would not make sense if they just totally got integrated into some other population as well. What has been the dominant Book of Mormon historical narrative since the founding of the church is what I read before from 2nd Nephi, in that it was a land that was preserved for others. So any other comments on that last paragraph?
Yeah. So one thing I've noticed is going back to like saying that there's no DNA at all is when Jesus visited the Americas in 3rd Nephi, chapter 8 through 10, there was an extensive explanation of how he obliterated, drowned, burned the first round of basically evidence. And this is right after in the Bible, he dies saying, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He doesn't go back to have Herod, who killed John the Baptist, killed. He doesn't go back to have any of his own murderers killed, but he spends an extensive amount of time annihilating civilizations and listing all of these civilizations that are annihilated, which effectively gets rid, perhaps in Joseph Smith's mind, of any DNA for the entire population leading up to that point. And then at the end of the Book of Mormon, we have the two entire civilizations annihilating each other. And it's very clear that they're all dead and that the last author is dying. And that kind of also, when it's kind of saying that the Book of Mormon doesn't say there's not other peoples, the Book of Mormon is still pretty clear that a whole bunch of people, that all the people it's referencing to are wiped out.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, so go ahead. Yes, please.
She makes a great point with what the Book of Mormon is talking about, all the annihilation and who's left, with the church saying, one, they don't know anything about the people that were already here. They have no evidence over the DNA, like they say that there's no clear identifying DNA today about those mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Yet the way that the church interprets the Book of Mormon is very literal, that all these people are Lamanites. And one example of that happened recently, where at the BYU Education Week, there was a talk given talking about Columbus coming and how he was prophesied of, and that he is specifically who was prophesied of to come in the Book of Mormon, that across the great waters, he would be guided by God. And as a result of this talk given just last month, there's been a number of Indigenous people speaking out against it that are active members. And they're stating in this essay that they have no evidence, yet the church, many members in the church, including leaders, go ahead and make assumptions about specific locations, specific people. Specifically, Columbus was prophesied of in 1 Nephi chapter 13, verse 12, as coming. When you read about the things that Columbus did, they're atrocious. There's an article that was printed in, let me take a look really quick, Universe, on BYU.edu, It's available. The Daily Universe, a indigenous member of the church reacted to what was taught at Education Week last month. And at one point she says, "Why must the great waters represent the Atlantic Ocean? For indigenous peoples of the Americas, there are many great waters. We know, for example, the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. We are also aware of the islands dotted through the Pacific people by great boat builders and ocean navigators. This speculation that this great spirit mentioned in the Book of Mormon must be European represents biases that assume the supremacy of white people." Her article is actually amazing. It's beautiful. And this is where I support indigenous people that want to be in the church. But just like this gal's writing, it shouldn't be assumed what the locations are, who was here, who wasn't here, who is of what heritage, and making all these assumptions. And this admitting that nothing is known about the extent of anything.
Yeah.
That's where anything that's talked about the specific DNA, they're just appealing to members. But between the lines, they're admitting throughout this entire essay that they don't know anything.
Yeah, let's make sure and link that essay or article, opinion piece that you're mentioning in the show notes for the listener. We'll make sure and link that as well as link to information about that presentation on Columbus from Education Week. I think it would be helpful for the reader to see the problems from literalism and from and really the racism that is born out of taking the Book of Mormon literally with regard to having it be a historical text, with regard to who the Lamanites are and what Christopher Columbus was and who he was led by and so forth.
There's an additional one that I'd like to link to you also then. I want to say it was in 2017, might have been 2018, but I'm pretty sure it was in 2017 at Hawaii BYU. All the kids at BYU were spoken to by a church leader that they were, it was telling them who their heritage was, and that even though a lot of Pacific Islanders didn't like the term Lamanite, they should be proud of it. On top of that, it was saying that they were the more righteous Lamanites than the Native Americans. They were saying you guys are more spiritual, you were protected, you were not swept from the land. Like the Native Americans, they were the bad Lamanites, you guys were the good Lamanites. I'm paraphrasing, but it was offensive to me, and it also made me upset for them. I'm like, they have a beautiful heritage, and if they don't like the term Lamanite, listen to them. They know their heritage, they know their history, and they should be able to join whatever church without being identified. But by stating some Lamanites are good and some Lamanites are bad, that was very eye-opening to me, because I'd run into Lamanites from other backgrounds that weren't Native American that had a completely different view of that label. And it wasn't until later that I have found this teaching is common in South America too, that Native Americans are viewed as the Lamanites that were swept from the land because we experienced such heavy genocide.
That goes right along with what the Book of Mormon itself says as well. In the printer's manuscript, the 1830 and the 1837 edition, they use the term white. So in 2 Nephi 36-7, it says, "Their scales of darkness shall fall from their eyes, and they'll become a pure and white people." And eventually in 1981, which is long after Joseph Smith translated the truest book on earth, the edition is changed to pure. And so we see that kind of same thing happening with this entire essay, instead of like they have for the entire history of the church claiming direct descent from Native Americans. Now they're trying to say, it could be other things as well and incorporate Native Americans, even though the entire church history has been clear about the racism, the skin color, the curse, and the curse being lifted.
Yeah, and for the listener, there have been some recent Mormon Stories interviews with Dan Vogel and with John Hamer talking about the mound builder myths that kind of tie into this idea that early residents of the U.S. In Joseph Smith's area, they had these legends with regard to who the Native Americans were and why they had dark skin, and that there was some sort of superior white-skinned race, that was was exterminated by who's left in terms of Native Americans. This was part of the culture of the time and might have been material that Joseph then eclectically aggregated and put into the narrative of the Book of Mormon. But it's a challenge. One of my experiences as I was going through my faith transition and reading this essay and some of the others is this challenge of the narratives that there are such things as choice, chosen, or favored people of God, particularly by lineage. Like that became very untasteful. That's probably not the strong enough word. It became very disappointing to me, this narrative that God has chosen, choice, favored people by lineage, by race, by gender, by sexual orientation, and so forth. And one of the gifts, I would say, of my faith crisis was to totally reject and totally let that go, and see every human being that I meet as infinitely and equally valuable, regardless of this idea that God has choice, chosen, and favored people, and that lineage and race matters. So anyway, Sarah, would you read the next, let's say, couple paragraphs?
Okay, we're understanding.
Understanding the genetic evidence.
Understanding the genetic evidence. A brief review of the basic principles of genetics will help explain how scientists use DNA to study ancient populations. It will also highlight the difficulty of drawing conclusions about the Book of Mormon from the study of genetics. DNA, the set of instructions
in sustaining life, is found in the nucleus of almost every human cell. It is organized into 46 units called chromosomes, 23 received from each parent. These chromosomes contain about 3.2 billion instructions. Any two individuals share approximately 99.9% of their genetic arrangement, but the thousands of small differences account for a tremendous variation between people.
All right, Michelle, you had a note on that paragraph.
Yep. So this section, understanding the genetic evidence, it kind of tries to work as a 101 for DNA science, and that's possibly with the intent to bore members out of reading too much into things and reinforce that sense of knowing. The Book of Mormon itself has overwhelming scripture, basically repeating over and over, their dark skins will become light. Even with Mary, it says, and it came to pass that she, I beheld a virgin and she was exceedingly fair and white, which is funny because Mary was a Jew. So even then there's so much racism slipped into the Book of Mormon. And it's saying they're understanding the genetic evidence of what there's nothing known about the DNA of Book of Mormon people. That's a contradiction that's stated even with this very title, and it's trying to sell, like, again, to the member who's just kind of skimming through, look, we know what we're talking about, like you had said earlier, a carefully worded lawyer's writing, so that somebody can glance at this and say, okay, I'm pacified, I don't need to ask any more questions.
Yeah, that's a strategy, it seems like, in apologetics, is to make something sound really, really complicated. And often it is complicated, but they make it seem really, really complicated, and then they try to express that people that are a lot smarter than us have looked at it and it's not a problem, so it shouldn't be a problem for us, and we don't really need to look at it with very much depth because, this appeal to higher authority, they've figured it out, and so we should just be fine with it.
Exactly.
All right. So, Sarah, would you like, unless you have a comment, would you read the next couple paragraphs?
Genetic variations are introduced through what geneticists call random mutation. Mutations are errors that occur as DNA is copied during the formation of reproductive cells. These mutations accumulate over time as they are passed from generation to generation, resulting in unique genetic profiles. The inheritance pattern of the first 22 pairs of chromosomes, called autosomes, is characterized by continuous shuffling. Half of the DNA from both the father and the mother recombine to form the DNA of their children. The 23rd pair of chromosomes determines the gender of a child. Because only males have the Y chromosome, the son inherits this chromosome, mostly intact from his father.
Go ahead and continue on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Human cells also have DNA in a series of cell components called mitochondria. DNA is relatively small, containing approximately 17,000 instructions, and is inherited largely intact from the mother. The mother's mitochondrial DNA is passed to all of her children, but only her daughters will pass their mitochondrial DNA to the next generation. Mitochondrial DNA was the first type of DNA to be sequenced and was thus the first that geneticists used to study populations. As technology has improved, analysis of the autosomal DNA has allowed geneticists to conduct sophisticated studies involving combinations of multiple genetic markers.
Go ahead and continue. Yeah.
Population genetics attempt to reconstruct the origin, migration, and relationship of populations using modern and ancient DNA samples. Examining available data, scientists have identified combinations of mutations that are distinctive of populations in different regions of the world. Unique mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome profiles are called haplogroups. Scientists designated these haplogroups with letters of the alphabet.
So, Michelle, you had a note on that paragraph.
Yep. So essentially all throughout here, I just want to read a little passage from the Book of Mormon because there are many, and it says, "As they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, the Lord God did cause a skin of blackness to come upon them." And that's in 2 Nephi 5:21. And it continues describing them as loathsome, full of iniquities and cursed. So this is all throughout the Book of Mormon, being clear that those that they taught who are Native Americans are of the Lamanites. They describe them in very kind of horrific ways. And this entire essay is kind of completely dodging that and just using modern day definitions of DNA that have nothing to do with the DNA of the Book of Mormon that doesn't exist, to try to tell people, oh, it's okay, it's not, it doesn't actually, none of that actually means what it says. It's probably spiritual. It's not actually talking about skin. And as a member, a new member, or a member born to the church, I would probably look at this and the strategy already would take hold. I'd be like, okay, they know what they're talking about. And it takes hard questions to see past the illusion. Especially if the book were treasured to me in any way, I'd see the intellectual speak as an effort made to present its stance. And an intellectual appeal is a tactic in sales as well. It can be said here, each member has a worthiness stamp and brings them in a minimum of 10% of their income per pay period. So they see this and they're like, okay, this supports what I care about. But the more intelligently something is presented, the more likely it can appeal to an audience or subdue an audience from actual truth. And this is effective in politics, business, or any sort of presentation where the goal is to keep the consumer believing and send product to sustain revenue. And that's why it's essential to be actively open to all angles of what's presented. We'll read reviews on Amazon, for example, no matter how well a product is described, and we'll be able to get kind of an accurate reading of whether the product's effective or not. Yet we struggle to do this with a lifelong religion because it's been ingrained into us with this sense of security since childhood that we don't see the same deceptive practices of sales of an idea being sold to us for somebody else's gain.
I'd like to add something here too. You
Yes.
spoke about skin color being like some of the apologetics around skin color is that, oh, it's not actually skin color. It's about spirituality. That darkness falls away because you've got the light of the gospel or something. But in the seminary manuals, at least 3 years ago, might have been 2 years ago, I'll have to look at my blog, I covered the seminary manual because in the seminary manual, it specifies skin color. So even if apologetics are saying, oh, it's not talking about skin, it was officially taught as skin. Additionally, the missionaries last year taught me. They didn't know that I'd been a member. I was being polite and kind to them, but they specifically taught me that my skin was darkened because of the curse upon my people. They also told me that Native Americans, when Columbus came, the reason Native Americans did not have religion was because of us falling away from the gospel. So I was taught these two things, and it triggered me to where I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe, this was just said to me again, because I've been trying to go on this healing journey of getting out of all these teachings. But it's still taught as literally skin color by official representatives of the church. Earlier, Michelle, you used the term, I used it a bunch when I first left. Oh, plausible deniability. That's where this is a legal document, and it is providing both plausible deniability to members as well as non-members. Like, it's plausibly deniability with whether or not Lamanites exist either way. They're trying to take this very legal escape out of the real issues that underlie everything. And right now, official representatives of the church are teaching people that they are Lamanites and that their skin is darkened because of a curse. The apologetics don't matter.
Yep, the apologetics are just to cover up for anybody that even starts to look deeply. And one comment I wanted to make on that is, I remember in my mission, there was a 70 that actually came and said, the reason you guys are using Preach My Gospel and teaching my spirit is because the last generation of missionaries were not worthy. I would look them in the eye and they weren't worthy enough as you guys. And I always felt off about that. Then I come to find out the last generation of missionaries were indoctrinated to use a lineage chart for African Americans to tell them where they were from. So the leaders are blaming the last generation on their unrighteousness when this was literally the leaders who were teaching missionaries to go out and read to people of different skin colors where they came from as part of their curriculum if asked. And that was as recently as like my parents' time for serving missions. So this is all very real. And as soon as the leaders change the narrative, people go along with it, even though just the other day it was something else.
Yeah. So I have a couple comments. So number one, it's true that apologists will say, well, the text doesn't demand it, and then they'll come up with some sort of reconciliation for what the text of the Book of Mormon says. But when the institution and the culture and the materials from the church teach something that's different than their reconciliation of the text, that's a pretty weak apologetic, at least in my view, to say the text doesn't demand this idea of skin curse when, like what you're saying, Sarah, missionaries are still teaching skin curse, and seminary materials, CES materials that are somewhat recent still were teaching those kinds of things.
If I could read this little conversation, I pulled it up on the blog so you could actually hear what this is saying. So after she said that, here, let me, she said, yes, the skin curse or the skin color change was just a sign of a curse, not the curse itself. And so I asked, so skin was darkened due to the curse? And the missionary replied, a curse was put upon the people. The curse was that they were withdrawn from the Spirit of God because they were wicked. The others needed to sign a sign to help them know who didn't have the Spirit with them. So their skin was darkened so they could see who was who. Dark skin is not the curse itself. She then shared 2 Nephi 5:21, talking about the curse, and then just read that whole bit. And then I responded and I said, skin color existed long before this timeline. This is naive. Are you telling me God put dark skin on all the people of the world when they were bad? Does this mean that only white people were not cursed? I actually have a different article that talks about that one of the church leaders literally says that that dark people had been cursed. But the missionary says, not all the people of the world. We only know of the Lamanites. We need to recognize that this was one situation under these circumstances 2,000 years ago. It is not saying all Black people are wicked or cursed at all. Just the indigenous people.
Oh my goodness.
is what she was referring to. So when I say like this is still current, Native American children are being taught this. I was raised with this. It's not something that is just the apologetics. They need to look at who their official representatives, what their official representatives are teaching, and then they need to be legally held responsible for that.
Yeah, they definitely need to be corrected. Things need to be a lot healthier than what they are right now, even still.
And I kind of wonder if, like what happened with Michelle, with the previous generation of missionaries being blamed, that was just a kid, I was so upset because there's this kid, and I was no different at that age. I believed everything. I would have been that kid if I served a mission, believed that about my own people and went out and taught it. So I don't hold that missionary responsible. But is that missionary going to be the one, missionaries like that, held accountable for things that are taught in seminary?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very problematic. So Sarah, would you read the next paragraph then?
At the present time, scientific consensus holds that the vast majority of Native Americans belong to sub-branches of the Y chromosome haplogroup C and Q14 and the mitochondrial DNA haplogroups A, B, C, D, and X, all of which are predominantly East Asian. But the picture is not entirely clear. Continuing studies, sorry, I just have to laugh there, but the picture is not entirely clear. Continuing studies provide new insights and some challenge previous consensus. For example, a 2013 study states that as much as 1/3 of Native American DNA originated anciently in Europe or West Asia and was likely introduced into the gene pool before the earliest migrations to the Americas. This study paints a more complex picture than is suggested by the prevailing opinion that all Native American DNA is essentially East Asian. So I have to stop there.
Yep.
Because it talks about migrations that predate, like, what does it say? As much as 1/3 of Native American DNA originated anciently in Europe or West Asia and was likely introduced into the gene pool before the earliest migrations to the Americas. They leave out dates or timelines.
Yeah.
Because we're talking not a couple thousand years. We're talking tens of thousands of years.
Yeah. So the study cited is of a Siberian male from 24,000 years ago. So it's not even close to, the 13 to 15,000 years ago of the East Asian migration. It's not remotely close to, 2000 BCE or 600 BCE. My note, drawing from a post that is on my blog, is there's no easy way to say this other than that this footnote and this paragraph is meant to deliberately deceive the lay reader. It is incredibly academically dishonest. The last sentence of the paragraph is particularly deceptive in that it says the study paints a more complex picture than is suggested by the prevailing opinion that all Native American DNA is essentially East Asian, unquote. The study that's cited is of a Siberian male from 24,000 years ago. Human migrations originated in Africa many, many thousands of years ago, and eventually, if you go back far enough, we have that common DNA, but that particular paragraph and that use of that site in footnote 16 is just incredibly dishonest to mislead the reader to think, oh, it's really complex. It's the vast majority, even though it's more than 99%. Yeah, so there's a chance. Yeah, well, 24,000 years ago, we found somebody that did have, European DNA.
Which even by using that example, they discount the entire timeline of the Book of Mormon then. And it comes back again to it not being valid. The land was not empty 2,000 years ago.
Right. All right. Why don't you go to the next couple paragraphs there?
Well, Near Eastern DNA markers do exist in the DNA of modern Native populations, it's difficult to determine whether they are the result of migrations that predated, such as described in the Book of Mormon, or whether they stem from genetic mixing that occurred after the European conquest. This is due in part to the fact that the molecular clock used by scientists to date the appearance of genetic markers is not always accurate enough to pinpoint the timing of migrations that occurred as recently as a few hundred or even a few thousand years ago. Scientists do not rule out... Oh, go ahead.
We'll add links to the show notes that are reviews of the essay, including this footnote of 17, indicating that this paragraph is very misleading too. So go ahead.
Scientists don't rule out the possibility of additional small-scale migrations to the Americas. For example, a 2010 genetic analysis of a well-preserved 4,000-year-old Paleo-Eskimo in Greenland led scientists to hypothesize that a group of people besides those from East Asia had migrated to the Americas. Commenting on this study, population geneticist Marcus Feldman of Stanford University said, models that suggest a single one-time migration are generally regarded as idealized systems. There may have been small amounts of migrations going on for millennia.
Yeah, and this is still very, very problematic because they're trying to make it sound like the Lehite migration or the Jaredite migration would fit into what they're talking about here.
Except for the timeline.
Except for the timeline's all messed up.
Like if a well-preserved 4,000-year-old, it throws out the Great Flood. It throws out, anytime you study migration, it throws off the Book of Mormon timeline.
Yeah. All right. Unless, Michelle, you have a comment, I'll go to the next section on the founder effect. All right. So the founder effect. One reason it is difficult to use DNA evidence to draw definite conclusions about Book of Mormon peoples is that nothing is known about the DNA that Lehi, Sariah, Ishmael, and others brought to the Americas. Even if geneticists had a database of the DNA that now exists among all modern American Indian groups, it would be impossible to know exactly what to search for. It is impossible that each member of the immigrating parties described in the Book of Mormon had DNA typical of the Near East, but it is likewise possible that some of them carry DNA more typical to other regions. In this case, their descendants might inherit a genetic profile that would be unexpected given their family's place of origin. This phenomenon is called the founder effect. Sarah, you had a note there. So, so that's problematic too. And it's kind of beyond the scope of the discussion today, but archaeologists and historians have studied Israelite origins, and the conclusions that they've come to is that the story of the lost 10 tribes is a Jewish origin myth that's similar to the flood and the Tower of Babel and the Exodus, that those things don't have historical data to support, and that the Israelites really primarily grew out of the Canaanite population there, and so that is messy to go back and try to figure out what DNA would be there. But the whole Book of Mormon is based on lineal descendants of the House of Israel and this idea of lost 10 tribes and a gathering of lineal descendants of the Israelites. And so they're kind of speaking out of both sides of their mouth here, saying that, we're gathering Israel, we're gathering lineal descendants of the House of Israel, which is problematic because that's largely based on the Jewish origin myth of the lost tribes, according to non-apologetic historians. But at the same time, on this side, they're saying, well, we couldn't really know what DNA they would be bringing in anyway. So it's messy.
Well, and they specify one reason it is difficult to use DNA evidence to draw definite conclusions about the Book of Mormon people. Like, they're admitting that they have no idea any evidence about the Book of Mormon people. And the reason they say it's difficult to draw conclusions, it's not difficult to draw conclusions about Native Americans. It's difficult to draw conclusions about the mythical Lamanites.
Right. Yeah.
So right there, they're saying we have zero evidence, and it's almost like they're trying to say, oh, we can't use DNA to tell us anything. But what they can't use DNA to do is to back up the Book of Mormon. Yeah. Plenty is known about the people of the Americas.
Yeah. All right, I'll continue. Consider the case of Dr. Ugo A. Perego, a Latter-day Saint population geneticist. His genealogy confirms that he is a multi-generational Italian, but the DNA of his parental genetic lineage is from a branch of the Asian Native American Haliogroup C. This likely means that somewhere along the line, a migratory event from Asia to Europe led to the introduction of DNA atypical of Perego's place of origin. If Perego and his family were to colonize an isolated landmass, future geneticists conducting a study of his descendants' Y chromosomes might conclude that the original settlers of the landmass were from Asia rather than Italy. This hypothetical story shows that conclusions about genetics of population must be informed by a clear understanding of this DNA of the population's founders. In the case of the Book of Mormon, clear information of that kind is unavailable. Because it's not available. So there's a chance, I guess, and majority more than 99% is problematic. The next little section I'll read, population bottleneck and genetic drift. The difficulties do not end with the founder effect, even if it were known with a high degree of certainty that immigrants described in the Book of Mormon had what might be considered typically Near Eastern DNA. It is quite possible that their DNA markers did not survive the intervening centuries. Principles well known to scientists, including population bottleneck and genetic drift, often lead to a loss of genetic markers or make those markers nearly impossible to detect. And then there's a graphic in the essay that shows marbles in a population bottleneck with a catastrophic event. The text says, of the essay says, population bottleneck is a loss of genetic variation that occurs when a natural disaster, epidemic, disease, massive war, other calamity results in the death of a substantial part of the population. These events may severely reduce or totally eliminate certain genetic profiles. In such cases, a population may regain genetic diversity over time through mutation, but much of the diversity of that previously existed is irretrievably lost. Illustration of a population bottleneck. Due to a dramatic reduction in population, some genetic profiles represented in the graphic by the yellow, orange, green, and purple circles are lost. Subsequent generations inherit only the DNA of the survivors. In addition to the catastrophic war at the end of the Book of Mormon, European conquest of the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries touched off just such a cataclysmic change of events. As a result of war and spread of disease, many Native American groups experienced devastating population losses. One molecular anthropologist observed that the conquest, quote, squeezed the entire Amerindian population through a genetic bottleneck, unquote. He concluded this population reduction has forever altered the genetics of the surviving groups, thus complicating any attempts at reconstructing pre-Columbian genetic structure in most New World groups. So I had a note on that, but it looks like Michelle had a couple notes. I want to make sure that you have a chance to comment. Do you have comments, Michelle? So let's see. So my note was one could argue the annihilation of Jaredites and Nephites would create a population bottleneck. Yeah, that's right. It stopped. We'll go ahead and edit this.
I had a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
Just with if even following their logic, like there's all this genetic diversity and basically direct heritage that's been lost, they're still teaching people that they are literal descendants of this one little group, when really they're descendants of massive amounts of a different group. You know, the bottleneck, I don't know if it's just how I view it. Like, I don't really look at their science, because the way they describe science in this, I have a hard time even acknowledging it because they manipulate it so much. But when you are a direct descendant of someone, there is a genetic connection also. Like when you are looking at my own children, like when I look at my children, I can see they are genetically mine. You know, there's that connection. I look like my mom. I look like my grandma. And there's that connection through genetics. But here, it's if the population got completely squeezed and we lost the Lamanite DNA because it got squeezed out, you know, like through this population bottleneck, they're trying to manipulate the population bottleneck as if there's a chance that some of the genetics are still there somewhere. They just got lost, and we don't know, you know, where they got lost to. But it discounts a completely different heritage at the same time then. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like, what about the people that did survive? What about the people that weren't from this mythical Lamanite heritage?
That's a good point.
It's discounting true heritage of people that survived, of beautiful people that had beliefs that we have a connection to, that we are honestly, you know, connected to. And it says, and in the next moment, they're saying, you are the direct descendants. You are the children of Lehi. And by doing that, it's completely ignoring the real heritage. So to me, I have a hard time acknowledging their use of science because I look at what their use of science is actually doing to an indigenous background. I don't know if it makes sense, really, like how I described it, hopefully. But yeah, it's discounting real people, real heritage, real people that have survived. You know, you look at the Trail of Tears and the trauma that Native Americans went through, and the people that survived, that are here, that are living, that have that heritage of grandfathers and grandmothers that fought for their survival. And then to say, you know, even though there's no DNA from this mythical group, your direct descendants and literal, you know, children of Lehi, it's not even using their own science correctly in a respectful way towards indigenous people. And I say their science because this is not the world science. This is how the church is using science in their own way to, you know, do that plausible deniability and just enough doubt in science to make it seem possible.
Yeah. And speaking of that, when you're saying how the church is using science, there were some studies directly from church historians. One was Professor Scott R. Woodward in 2003, and Gordon B. Hinckley actually fired him. He was a DNA researcher for BYU, and he tested over 6,000 Native Americans and determined 98% of their DNA was from Asia. So for that situation, that's not brought up in here, other than the short ode to some people argue it's from Asia. What's funny is that's actually from a church historian. Another church historian in 1952 organized the New World Archaeological Foundation. His name was Thomas Stewart Ferguson. He was paid by the first presidency and had founded it. And by 1975, he realized that the entire pursuit was in vain. It failed the 4 archaeological tests: the plant life test, the animal test, the meta-allergy test, and the script test. So in his 29-page response to Mormon apologists called the Written Symposium on the Book of Mormon Geography, he said, with all of these great efforts, it cannot be established factually that anyone from Joseph Smith to the present day has put his finger on a single point of terrain that was a Book of Mormon geographical place. And the hemisphere has been pretty well checked out by competent people. Thousands of sites have been excavated. He concluded the essay saying, to date, there is no Book of Mormon geography. So their DNA markers of stories have with actual history show millions of people that do survive, but not in the Book of Mormon because there's simply no DNA markers. And there are historians, but they're not mentioned in this article.
Wow, that's amazing. Like scientists can't even do their work without losing their job. Like they have to fit into that church narrative to be able to continue in their work. I can't believe he was fired for simply the results that he found.
Yep. And even now we see that the current president of the church is trying to make sure nobody asks questions. Just yesterday, I believe, he was at a devotional and he said not to trust Google and not to trust, especially don't trust anyone disaffected by the church. So that kind of goes right along with that lawyer presentation of making sure nobody thinks to question.
And control the narrative.
Yep.
All right.
Genetic drift is the gradual loss of genetic markers in small populations due to random events. A simple illustration is often used to teach this concept. Fill a jar with 20 marbles, 10 red, 10 blue. The jar represents a population, and the marbles represent people with different genetic profiles. Draw a marble at random from this population, record its color, and place it back in the jar. Each draw represents the birth of a child. Draw 20 times to simulate a new generation within the population. The second generation could have an equal number of each color, but more likely it will have an uneven number of the 2 colors. Before you draw a third generation, adjust the proportion of each color in the jar to reflect the new mix of genetic profiles in the gene pool. As you continue drawing, the now uneven mix will lead to ever more frequent draws of the dominant color. Over several generations, this drift toward one color will almost certainly result in the disappearance of the other color.
Thanks. So I'd make a comment at this point. They covered here population bottleneck and genetic drift a little bit. What they're suggesting here, I think what they're suggesting here is that the Lehites would come over to the Americas and then immediately totally intermarry into the existing populations, which would dilute their DNA so that we'd end up with this population genetic drift. But that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. First of all, in the text of the Book of Mormon, it suggests that the darker skinned people, were done that, they had that from God so that the righteous Nephites wouldn't intermarry with them. And the narratives from the Israelites that supposedly the Lehites, are lineal descendants of, were very anti intermarriage into native populations, in the Bible. With the idea was, at least in the Jewish origin myths, is that they weren't supposed to intermarry with later on the Samaritans or with the Midianites or with the Canaanites and so forth. So it just doesn't make any sense. What they're suggesting here is that the Lehites would come over, they would immediately totally marry into and integrate into existing populations, including people that weren't white and delightsome, or whichever is the current text in the Book of Mormon, pure and delightsome, and then be diluted out because of genetic drift, and then have events like population bottlenecks from catastrophic events. It's not represented in the text, and it just doesn't make any sense based on what is in the text, is my view.
That's completely accurate. And the fact is, if Joseph Smith could spin that up in the 19th century and say it happened too long ago to pinpoint exact evidence, it can still be sold into the 21st century. He prophesied the Book of Mormon would be purchased by Canada. It's copyright, but it didn't sell. But he'd be happy to know his business is still booming in America. Maybe not numbers, but financially.
All right, Michelle, would you go ahead and continue the next few paragraphs?
Yes. So it says, it shows the illustration of the genetic drift using colored marbles, and says this exercise illustrates the inheritance pattern of genetic material over the course of several generations, and shows how drift can result in the loss of genetic profiles. The effect of drift is especially pronounced in small, isolated populations, or in cases where a small group carrying a distinct genetic profile intermingles with a much larger population of a different lineage. The study in Iceland combining both genetic and genealogical data demonstrates that the majority of people living in that country today inherited mitochondrial DNA from just a small percentage of the people who lived there only 300 years ago. So just a side note I wanted to comment on that is somebody might be looking at this and think, oh, a study confirms the Book of Mormon, a prospective member or a dedicated member. But we see here an illusion taking place of appealing to the intellect, again, to keep product selling. It has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. This study, the people involved in this study had nothing to do with the religion itself. And it's used to demonstrate a point that can't be demonstrated, because there's residual DNA that survived in this Iceland study, as I'll say, but there's no DNA that survived for people from the Book of Mormon, just none at all. So when it says the mitochondrial DNA of the majority of Icelanders living at that time simply did not survive the random effects of the drift, it is conceivable that much of the DNA of the Book of Mormon peoples did not survive for the same reason. You want me to go on to the next paragraph?
Sure, go ahead. Yep.
Okay. Genetic drift particularly affects mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome DNA, but it also leads to the loss of variation in autosomal DNA. When a small population mixes with a large one, combinations of autosomal markers typical of the smaller group become rapidly overwhelmed or swamped by those of larger. The smaller group's markers soon become rare in the combined population and may go extinct due to the effects of genetic drift and bottlenecks as described above. Moreover, the shuffling and recombination of the autosomal DNA from generation to generation produces new combinations of markers in which the predominant genetic signal comes from the larger original population. This can make the combinations of markers characteristic of the smaller group so diluted that they cannot be reliably identified.
I had a comment there.
Go ahead.
Just really quick. This again just comes back to my last point, which I don't really know how to explain what I'm thinking when I say it, but it's disrespectful to the majority population. It's disrespectful to that majority heritage. They're saying that this small group joined this larger group, and so that smaller group's genetic markers were lost, or they have the genetic drift and the bottleneck and all these ideas of why we can't find the markers anymore. But it's discounting that larger group that pre-existed, that was not Lamanite, that is the predominant, heritage for all these people. And they're discounting the true heritage for this small group that we can't find any markers for. And that's disrespectful of the true heritage of the people. So it's just saying the same thing again, like that they can't find this small little group because of all these different reasons. They cannot be reliably identified, is what it says.
And again, in order for that to happen, the Lehites would have to come over and immediately intermarry as a very small band of people into a very, very large existing population, which just doesn't make any sense because of the text of the Book of Mormon is about staying pure and not intermarrying with people that don't hold the same values as you, and Nephi builds a temple and all these other kinds of things. It just doesn't make any sense to me, this argument.
No, the science is just ridiculous. And on top of it, say that they integrated into this larger group that existed. And so right there, they're admitting that there was populations that lived here where the Book of Mormon said it was empty. They're admitting that there was other people that weren't from these mythical, groups that came over to the Americas, that people were here. And so that alone kind of puts a spin on the whole direct descendants, because there was already people here. They say that right there.
And still, like Sarah, you mentioned, as recently as in the last 2 years, we have missionaries and we have CES material indicating something otherwise, that that these are, that you would be a lineal descendant of Lehi.
Yeah, I was told that last year, and this year, I think the BYU thing was last year also. Yeah, you're right. But I don't keep up on every single talk given. I'm sure it's still being taught currently to people.
Yeah. So Michelle, would you read the last paragraph of that section?
It says the authors of a 2008 paper in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology summarized the impact of these forces succinctly. Genetic drift has been a significant force on Native American genetics, and together with a major population crash after European contact has altered halogroup frequencies and caused the loss of many haplotypes. Genetic profiles may be entirely lost, and combinations that once existed may become so diluted that they are difficult to detect. Thus, portions of a population may in fact be related genealogically to an individual or group, but not have DNA that can be identified as belonging to those ancestors. In other words, Native Americans whose ancestors include Book of Mormon peoples may not be able to confirm that relationship using their DNA. Go figure.
I have a quick comment there.
Please.
I find it also interesting that the entire essay focuses on the Native Americans because they're the only ones that experienced mass genocide. But they also label everybody in the Pacific Islands and in South America as direct descendants of Lamanites, but they're not included in their twisting of science because they didn't experience the same things to the extent, that Native Americans did. So I find that interesting. I don't know what that says about the essay. I haven't really thought about it until now, but they're not addressing DNA in other populations outside of Native Americans that are indigenous to the lands.
Right. And then if I guess the strategy is if they stop talking about it, then it just goes away and gets forgotten down the memory hole or something.
Yep. Even though in the Book of Mormon, it's very clear that it's still going to be there in the Book of Mormon forever. Like back in 2 Nephi 30, many generations shall not pass away among them, save they shall be pure/white in 1830 and delightsome. Is that just saying everybody that was white is the good one and the other nations weren't? That's pretty clear there.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on DNA not being addressed as far as like even just like the Pacific Islands in this? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Kind of last minute curious question.
I think
I find it odd.
I'd have to go back. So we'll put in the show notes material from Thomas Murphy and from Simon Southerton. I don't recall if they comment on that, but that is kind of interesting that they just totally disregard these narratives with regard to Pacific Islanders being descendants of Lehi.
Yeah, like the essay. Well, I don't know why I haven't noticed before, but the essay, they only use Native Americans in this essay as they tried to say, okay, well, the bottleneck and all that stuff. But they've, as a church, it doesn't include just Native Americans. So are they saying that the DNA can't be used to prove Pacific Islanders either, and South Americans, did they all experience the same bottlenecks and genetic drift that they're saying, they're just using Native American populations that that died in mass numbers during colonization. It's just Native Americans in this that are being used. I don't know why I didn't, but I don't want to side from the conversation. So just curious.
All right. So Sarah, do you want to read the conclusion, and then we'll visit a little bit more?
Much as critics and defenders of the Book of Mormon would like to use DNA studies to support their views, the evidence is simply inconclusive. Nothing is known about the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples. Even if such information were known, processes such as population bottleneck, genetic drift, and post-Columbian immigration from West Eurasia make it unlikely that their DNA could be detected today. As Elder Dallin H. Oaks of the Forum of the 12 Apostles observed, it is our position that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Book of Mormon record keepers were primarily concerned with conveying religious truths and preserving the spiritual heritage of their people. They prayed that, in spite of the prophesied destruction of most of their people, their record would be preserved and one day help restore knowledge of the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Their promise to all who study the book with a sincere heart and real intent, having faith in Christ, is that God will manifest the truth of it unto you by the power of the Holy Ghost. For countless individuals who have applied this test of the book's authenticity, the Book of Mormon stands as a volume of sacred scripture with the power to bring them closer to Jesus Christ. The church acknowledges the contribution of scholars to the scientific content presented in this article. Their work is used with permission. I only have one real closing comment, in that they've admitted throughout the essay that evidence is not conclusive. They've admitted that people pre-existed in the Americas. They've admitted that if there were Lamanites that came over, just giving them some space, and let's say, okay, somewhere, I'm going to pretend somewhere some Lamanites came over. They can't be specific about who exactly the Lamanites are. They can't be specific and identifying who direct descendants are. And with that in mind, if they can't be specific, if they have no evidence to say, hey, these people are 100% Lamanites, if handing the Book of Mormon out and telling indigenous people, this is a history of your people. By saying that, by using that as a tool, as an emotional manipulation to get people to join, by labeling people Lamanite without proof, that's my problem. It's not with, okay, let's say it's a spiritual book. Sure, you guys can say Lamanites at some point came over and they've been lost somewhere. I don't want to take spirituality or people's free choices over what church they join away from them. I want to support indigenous members as much as I do members that find their way out and are like, oh my gosh, I'm not Lamanite. I want both to feel that support and that freedom, because for how many generations of Native Americans, indigenous people, how many generations have been told what is okay to believe and what not to believe? Native Americans haven't been allowed religious freedom until, when was the Religious Freedom Act for Native Americans? What was it, like 1978? And even that act does not protect sacred sites. Native Americans have been told for hundreds of years, it's not okay to not be Christian. And I'm not going to tell an indigenous member that it's not okay to be Mormon. What I'd like to see from the church, and this is just personal because like everybody has their own views, and I don't want to like say that my view is the only view or the only way, but I'd like to see them say, let's not tell anybody they're Lamanites anymore. If an indigenous member reads the Book of Mormon and is like, hey, I think this is my people, that's their right. But for the entire church to go out and use it as a missionary tool to tell people that their people have been darkened because of a curse, to say your heritage is not what you think it is. I know more about your heritage than you do. And to hand that Book of Mormon over and say, this is your people. That's what I'd like to stop.
that goes right along with kind of like how I felt growing up as a member. There was a quote I read that was talking about at some point you'll always have a debt to truth, and I thought, just like you had said earlier, 19-year-old missionaries or 21-year-old missionaries, just kids going out. I thought I had the truth, but it wasn't, and I feel that debt to truth, and it's so carefully disguised, the racism in Mormonism, because you grow up and you slowly become aware that African Americans for a while were not treated equally. And then the whole Native American Indian aspect, I didn't even kind of realize there's that entire issue until recently. So many members go through not even seeing it. It's just so normal day to day to them. And even here, the church is still trying to do that. They're trying to present that. Even if such information were known, look at these scientific methods to reassure you. Every scrap of the Book of Mormon's origins may be non-existent, but it's really profound.
And they're taught to be proud of it. So anytime someone says, "Oh, I'm not proud of my Lamanite heritage," they say, "Oh, it doesn't matter that that your people had God completely withdraw his spirit from them because they were that evil. It doesn't matter that, you were dark, and look, you've got redemption for your people. You're the chosen generation of Lamanites, And so while you're trying to deal with internalizing all this racism, you're also being told to be proud of it at the same time. Just like the talk given at the BYU Hawaii, where they said, "We know that some of you are offended by the term Lamanite, but you should be proud of it." That was in 2017 or 2018. And it's just these kids, going to college, being told this, don't be upset about being Lamanite because you should be proud of it. So it's that same, that's one aspect of the racism that for me, I internalized it in such a way that I'm supposed to be proud of this, but it also affects how you view your heritage, how you view your identity is so connected to your ancestral heritage, and how you view other members of your family that haven't joined, how people view Native Americans in general, as members of the church. It affected me. I'll say one last thing, but I was in elementary, so I was like 3rd, 4th grade, and I went on a field trip in Virginia. We were living in Virginia at the time, and so it was great there. There was a lot of history of the country the teachers would teach, and it was around also during Thanksgiving time that we were talking about, that they definitely taught the Thanksgiving story that America embraced for a number of years, still does, but just that mythical story of how things went down in America. And I remember asking family and members of the church, well, where did all the Native Americans go? Where are they? I'm living in Virginia. This is the side of the country that all these things are happening in, that I'm learning about at school. Where are they all? And I was told the Book of Mormon gives us the reason why all the people died and were swept from the land. As a Native American, even though that wasn't my people, I identified with that. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna cry. But this is the number one reason. This idea of manifest destiny is number one reason why my blog exists, because I believed it. I'm so sorry.
No, thank you for your vulnerability.
Because looking at all the people that were swept from the land in my high school years, I got very passionate about reading the history of Native Americans, and it was overwhelming. So I'm still a believer, and I'm reading all these traumatic, truly terrible things that happened by Columbus, by so many people, things about Native Americans having their wells poisoned, their wells of water their water sources would be poisoned. They would be given blankets covered in disease because the people knew that it would kill off the populations. And so I'm reading all this and I'm thinking, this is what God wanted, because if our Native American ancestors had just been good enough, if they'd held on to the gospel, they wouldn't have been killed. And so as a Native American, being told that this is literal has a massive effect.
Yeah. Yeah, so these Christian Gentiles come, according to the Book of Mormon, they come to the Western Hemisphere and they commit genocide, like using methods like what you're explaining. And supposedly,
but I was taught to view that as like it was Native Americans' fault.
Yeah, fulfillment of prophecy, Native Americans' fault. Plus this narrative that the spiritual practices of indigenous peoples doesn't have God in it. You know, that there's nothing divine about what they do. And maybe I'm overstating the case, but I mean, you could tell me whether that was your lived experience. This idea that indigenous peoples, the reason that they experience what they're experiencing is because God has left them, because they abandoned the truth, and this was all fulfillment of prophecy, that it was merited to them because they left Jesus.
Yeah, I'll even go one step further and add that with the Indian placement program, children as young as 6 were being taught all this information about their people. And on top of that, they were told, when you go home in the summer, do not dance or participate in your cultural traditions because they are remnants of your people having turned away from God.
Oh,
if
wow.
you participate, you'll get kicked out of the program. And so their families wanted them in the program so much that they were basically caught in between two cultures because they weren't supposed to do that. And I experienced something similar in that when I would go home to see my people, I was told, don't dance with when they do the traditional dancing. And that was something that was a big part of what I loved. You know, I love watching when they would go to the lodge and start the drums up and start dancing. It moved me. But I had to look at that as, oh, this is a remnant of my people having turned away from God. So a lot of people look at the skin color as the predominant hurtful, painful issue. To me, that's secondary, because looking at your entire heritage and identity and your ancestry as being evil and having caused genocide of your people is so much more like it's the skin color is bad. Like it's offensive and upsetting, but it's like a side note to you've just destroyed an entire heritage. But so to me, I'm like, you know, let the Lamanite myth be whatever they want it to be as far as spiritual. I'm willing to give space to the Book of Mormon to be some spiritual, not in my opinion, it's not something that I would want in my life, but I understand that there's been a lot of trauma in indigenous communities.
All right. So I would say, to kind of summarize a couple things in terms of feedback as our lived experiences, would be to express to the church that the problems with historicity include some of these things that we were talking about with regard to racism and co-opting ancestral stories and suggesting that indigenous peoples, you know, have left God and they merited the kinds of destruction and genocide that they experienced. So those are certainly problems. So feedback to the church would be to say, stop telling people that are African American or of African descent that they're descendants of a literal historical Cain. Stop telling indigenous peoples that they're literal historical descendants of Lehi or of the Jaredites. Well, I guess it would be of Lehi because supposedly the Jaredites were exterminated. You know, stop doing those kinds of things. Stop telling people that their spiritual practices, are absent God. You know, see the beauty in spiritual practices, and that the divine can be experienced, or spirituality can be experienced in many practices. I think one solution is and I think more progressive Mormons would accept this, that if the Book of Mormon was looked at as a non-historical 19th century creation that was born out of origin myths and Joseph Smith's belief in the literal historicity of Jewish origin myths and the Bible, that would be a healthier construct to look at as a 19th century scripture that didn't need to be historical, based on Joseph Smith's paradigms, biases, and prejudices, because it would be less likely to be used to co-opt ancestral stories and this perpetuation of really racism that's inherent when that's taken historically.
And one thing I wanted to add is with multi-level marketing or Ponzi schemes or pyramid schemes, the goal that a lot of sales reps do is they tear at the identity of a person. And so if the church wants to represent itself more as a religion than as something that appears to be based off of Joseph Smith trying to make money and then a ripple effect, it does need to withdraw the attempts to tear down the identity of different races, of cultures, of women. and be more upfront and honest. Whereas this essay, it does say there's no DNA known, but it does a lot to cover that up so that it appears like there may be DNA to somebody just glancing at it.
Yeah, so my take is that when we look at this, the nuanced believer might look at this and say, well, it's the DNA stuff is unclear, but I prayed about the Book of Mormon and I felt good about it, and so it's a spiritual text. So I'm just going to set on the shelf the historicity implications of DNA. And that's kind of how the nuanced believer might experience this essay is I'm going to hold on to my spiritual experience with the Book of Mormon, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a historical text, or if it is a historical text, maybe it's just really messy and I really can't deal with it. That's my sense of how a nuanced believer that kind of understands the messiness of this essay might interpret this essay. But I continue to be astounded that my active believing friends can read the essay, including people with scientific backgrounds and physicians, people that have at least had some study, with regard to things that they could read the essay, that they could read the footnotes, and then come to such disparate reconciliations as to how transparent or helpful really the essay is. It just amazes me. But my sense is that they look at it, they're able to shelve things, and because they feel they feel a connection with the divine when they read the book or study the Book of Mormon. And so, maybe they don't necessarily need to know that it's historical or non-historical. That's my sense. Sarah, did you have, since we kind of got through the essay, do you have any final thoughts before we end the episode?
Just that I agree with kind of your view of it, and like that the church, if it is going to appeal to more progressive Mormons, because their children are going to be investigating things much more heavily than we did growing up, that they do need to be more transparent and stop kind of labeling who they're identifying for who's in their text, and try to shift it perhaps more to a book of spiritual enlightenment than as a historical text.
Yeah, and you mentioned children. I think that one was one of the keys for me in leaving also, was that I wasn't going to teach my children the same toxic beliefs once I understood that they were incorrect beliefs. People make mistakes, churches make mistakes, all of humanity, every organization that's existed has made mistakes. But at some point, children need to always come first. What would this world look like if the well-being of children, if every decision we made was measured by how does it affect children? They need to move forward with, correcting and moving towards those spiritual beliefs and moving away from official representatives of the church specifically telling families, children, college students, their identity and heritage. So
like in that BYU Education Week presentation just this summer. All right. So in any event, that will conclude our episode. If people want to give us feedback, we appreciate your feedback. You can message us on Facebook. Michelle and Sarah and I are on Facebook. You can make comments on the episode page on mormondiscussionpodcast.org. You can email me at unpackingambiguity@gmail.com. If people want to get in touch with you, Michelle and Sarah, how would they best do that?
For me, I have an Instagram with my husband, and it's just Brumation, or my Facebook works, or our email. It's BrumationCMX, BROOMATION @gmail.com.
Awesome. And Sarah?
Yeah, and for me, I'm on Instagram as Lamanite Truth. I'm on Facebook. I also have a Lamanite Truth Facebook page, and then of course there's the blog. So all avenues, everybody can contact me through those.
Excellent. I just want to express my appreciation to both of you, Michelle and Sarah, for participating today. This was very, very helpful to me to be able to have this conversation and have your points of view. And I really, really appreciate it. I just want to let you know that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate both of yours too.
And I appreciate being able to hear your experience, Sarah. That's very, very eye-opening, especially just growing up as your typical Quaker, not knowing everything Mormon.
Yeah.
I appreciate being on this podcast as well. And I learned a lot from you guys.
All right. Well, thank you. Well, to our listeners, look forward to more episodes where several of us will be sharing our experiences with the Gospel Topics essays.